Hello and welcome to The Review, where quality and trust come together. Each week we'll deliver new insights about strengthening your business through continual improvement, creating a safer, more secure world. I'm your host for this show, Randy Daugherty, Vice President of Business Development for the Performance Review Institute. Today we're talking to Bob Aanerud, Principal Consultant, Trainer, and Lead ISO 27001 Auditor for the JBW Group, which helps organizations to implement standards, achieve best practices, and information security management. Hello, Bob, and welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello. Well, I've been in this business for a number of years. I think going back to 1968 when the DoD had its first computer security initiative. And for people that understand the Rainbow series of books, the Orange Book, the Red Book, it was an attempt by NIST, NSA and NIST, to put together some standards and have some criteria for systems and whatnot. I also spent some time in the Marine Corps and consulting and doing 27,000, 20,000, 9,000, all the ISO series of standards audits for a number of different companies. Going way back. Currently, I'm working with JBW Group and SRI. For SRI, I do program management for these somewhat more technical standards.
So, Bob, cybersecurity affects us all in small and large ways, but it's something that clients and general public maybe don't always consider the risks until something goes wrong. So can you talk a little bit about the state of the industry and what you've seen and maybe in kinds of trends or risks or, impacts to people and businesses?
Of course. Risk assessment, risk management. Of course, most businesses know how to handle risk. They understand financial risk. They understand competency risk among their employees and whatnot. As far as security and privacy risk, they may not be as well familiar with some of the criteria, the standards, the risks, the issues, the threats that are out there. Certainly, I know when we talked about a sense of urgency, many companies have a sense of urgency about this, but they're confused. They don't really know what to do. It's chaos. Part of that is the lack of one single accepted standard or common ways of doing things. And that's become a real issue. If you look at security incidents and privacy incidents, security and privacy, of course, are kind of leading a lot of the concern and the journey towards security and privacy improvements. There's been about 100% a year increase in different kinds of incidents in the past couple of years. And that can, of course, affect a lot of companies, small businesses, large businesses, doesn't matter.
Yeah, and I think what I've experienced, we've all personally experienced, if you have a bank account, if you use your credit card at Target or whatever it might be, every one of those entities has been impacted through cybersecurity, which ultimately impacts the customer, which, our trust is on the company to manage that risk for us. And then, when we get notified, hey, we're the hotel you used last week, so those are the kinds of situations that it becomes more real to people. But don't you think part of the challenge is that it's so above people in the technology and they just don't know to how to manage it and how to understand the impacts. And so try to do the best you can and, don't answer the phone, don't click on the clickbait, things like that.
Of course, Facebook and Amazon and Google and Microsoft know more about me than my wife does.
Exactly.
Whenever you get on Facebook and you see ads for the underwear you were browsing yesterday, you know that they've got a lot of information on you. And privacy, of course, has become more of a concern in the past few years than security even. Because of GDPR and other high-level international and national legislation, rules, whatnot, there's been an uptick in all of that stuff. And many companies have I think, underfunded or under-resourced because they didn't understand the threat. Again, the threats and the impacts and the risk associated with unauthorized use or communication of that information.
And I think there's a certain amount of trust, even for those smaller organizations that outsource all of their, the cloud and all of the data storage and management. You say, "Hey, I signed a contract." They're the guys that are the experts. I'm trusting them to do everything that they need to do.
Of course, they're trusting them to do everything that they have not been able to do in the past.
Good point.
The Yeah, that's become a big issue, of course, with Amazon Web Services, Google, Microsoft Azure, other companies, and there are many that provide outsourced hosting services and whatnot. The cloud, right? And that's another thing when you talk about standards for cloud security and whatnot. There are a few out there, but again, it's still rather chaotic. The large partners, I've had a lot of experience with AWS and with Google and Azure. And they're pretty good. They try, but they're a business, and they're in the business of selling hosting services.
Right.
You pay for what you get in many ways.
Yep. Agreed. So talk a little bit about the framework of ISO 27001. Maybe a little bit. What is that standard? Where did it come from? And then what are the principles of that standard?
Okay. ISO, for those that don't understand what ISO is, it's the International Organization of Standards. And they create all kinds of standards and technical documents, normative documentation, which is for referral, things like that. 27001 started out as a British standard many, many years ago and was adopted in England and primarily European countries, became a certification standard, and it has evolved to the point now where it has accumulated, I think, a lot of best practice information, controls, and things like that, including not just the controls themselves, what you do to actually control, improve security, like passwords, like audits and things like that, but a general framework for the management of that criteria. Using a very old and very haloed standard, the Deming cycle.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Hey, so this standard has been out for quite some time. Bob, you and I go way back to the early days of this when we were working with some of the leading companies that were looking at this. So who are some of the companies now that are using, or what types of companies are using, or organizations are using ISO 27001?
Well, again, all organizations. I have some of my clients are multinational. One particular client, I won't mention their name, work in 140 countries. They've got 200,000 people working for them. They are 27001, which is security management certified, and they are also certified for privacy information management, another ISO standard, which is related to security. If you look at the large main hosting companies, the cloud companies like AWS, Amazon Web Services, Google, Microsoft Azure, they are all 27,000 plus certified. The government also has, and this is where the confusion comes in, the government has standards, and each company has different standards or different criteria. And some of them, fit the particular purpose and whatnot. Some of them don't. Much of it is, as we mentioned before, dependent on risk. What is your security risk? What is your privacy risk? What kind of information do you have? Do you know who has access to that information? And I also have companies as small as 2 people that get 27001 certified because they have a contractual requirement or because they deal with particularly sensitive information. And the biggest challenge in that is determining to what level do you go. The ISO standards are written so that they're supposedly applicable to any company, any size, and you can have a full scale scope covering the entire company and every contractor and employee in the known universe, or you can have a very limited scope. And I think the limited scope things, again, may have a little more risk, but again, it depends on the assessment of that risk and how accurate they are in determining what real requirements they are.
Yeah, I think it provides the framework for identifying the risks in the controls to mitigate that risk. And the common thread is that over time you'll have continual improvement. So your statement of applicability could change over time as you get, draw your circle a little bit bigger, maybe around what is being certified as well, the activities.
Oh, of course. And for many companies, small ones especially, they want to demonstrate the fact that they have gone to some pains, done risk assessment, have the basic management system in place. And again, you do that by first planning and then implementing or doing things,
Right.
and then continuing to improve and acting on those issues that you find. Um, it's a continuous cycle. It's never ending.
Right. And so once a company is certified to that standard, they maintain that certification over a period of time, correct?
Oh, yes, they must.
Yep.
The original certification, after some angst and expenditure of funds and resources, um, is performed by hopefully a certification body, one that is certified and accredited to do that. Uh, and then there's a period of time, usually a 3-year period, usually with 12-month surveillance audits, where the auditors come back, they relook at the criteria, the processes, the controls that are in place, and ensure that there's been continuous improvement and that incidents are managed and controlled, and a number of other things.
So, what are some of the examples of costs of an organization not taking steps to manage their data that you've seen? And we had a little bit of chat before we went live here, but there's lots of unfortunately bad experiences out there. That you probably have a better idea than I would.
There are a lot of bad experiences. Of course, the worst outcome is that your business will fail. Um, there are penalties. There are lack of loss of reputation issues. Um, Nobody wants to deal with someone that isn't going to manage their sensitive information in a reliable, reasonable manner. Um, Now, that doesn't say that there may be incidents and disclosures and breaches and whatnot. That's always a possibility. The ISO standards, I think, more than any other standard I'm aware of, give you a framework and then address through a risk management process reasonable levels of control, something that is reasonable, that is affordable. It can be changed from, if you're a small company, then you probably don't need the level of controls, the detail, the training, all of the other associated things that a large company has. So, it's supposed to be reasonable and flexible and attributable to any corporation or any company or entity, no matter what the size. When you get into um, international business, of course, when you talk about countries like the EU, for instance, that have their own set of privacy standards and security standards, and you've got EU countries that have different variants of that. Then you've got Canada, for instance, which has privacy information protection and digital information acts, things like that. Australia, Japan, um, not so much China, but many other companies or many
Yeah.
other countries. And you have to be aware of where that information is, where it's going. You know, Generally, there is an expectation that you will treat that information in the same manner, way, shape, and form that the international entity requires. And normally that's done through contractual documentation and citation of laws.
So the standard also then provides a framework for meeting regulatory requirements because where companies have maybe failed to meet these requirements, the expectations of their stakeholders, the government regulators are now stepping in and say, wait a minute, you can't have pictures, you can't have this information, you can't share this information. So it also provides a framework for meeting, especially if you're a multinational or just working in such as California or New York and other places,
Oh, of
a
course,
framework
yes.
to meet some of their expectations and legal requirements.
And there's where some of the chaos and the confusion comes in. In the United States, for instance, you got 50 states that have what are called state breach and disclosure laws. Those laws, like California, for instance, has a Privacy Act, which is relatively new, that covers almost any kind of information, including what is in a public phone book, and requires a certain level of protection. And then there are penalties and oversight associated with that. North Dakota has very restrictive laws and requires reporting of any breaches or disclosure within 12 hours of identification.
Yeah.
And there are others that have, like Nevada, that has encryption standards for certain types of sensitive information, things like that. That's just the United States. And then, of course, regulatory standards, contractual, administrative law, rules, if you're a government contractor, they all add to that. So it's very confusing. Now, ISO 27001 requires that you identify requirements from legal, regulatory, administrative law, statutory law, contractual terms and specifications and whatnot, and create a listing of that. And relatively speaking, the auditors must ensure that those things have been looked at, and they have attained the appropriate levels based on risk, and the company understands what the risk of non-fulfillment of those requirements are. So that's one benefit of ISO, is that that is a requirement that people identify it. Now, again, with 10,000 security and privacy laws in the United States alone, that's a difficult thing to do.
And I also see the same thing on the environmental side. ISO 14001, for example, is just
Of
you
course.
have a method to identify legal requirements and implement them into your system. But you're right, the challenges of all the regulatory requirements by state, by federal, by internationally, then it makes it more difficult to always identify and stay in compliance with those regulations.
Oh, it's amazing. I've spent myself and Dr. Patrick Sullivan and a few others have spent a lot of time putting together matrices where we look at all of these things, and these can be hundreds and hundreds of pages long. And the degree of assurance, which is something that is really not addressed per se in ISO, has to be looked at from your corporate business risk standpoint. What level of assurance and what level of risk can you tolerate? What type of implementation of a security control, like encryption, for instance? Do you need 56-bit? Do you need one-time cipher pad? Do you need 256-bit, multiple encryption with quantum, key management? It becomes very difficult to determine.
Yep, absolutely. So, are you seeing companies being more willing to invest in solidifying their risk management around cybersecurity? For example, seeking certification or implementing the standard requirements?
If they understand, what the risk is, and like I said before, there is a certain amount of urgency. Certainly, IT folks, security folks, privacy folks, compliance managers, things like that, and the legal folks, general counsel, understand that there is risk there, that they need to do something. I think, again, from my own perspective, back from 1968 and the Orange Book, which was a massive failure, through today, where now the government has yet another government industry standard, the capability certification model, CMMC, capability management.
Yep.
They've got some new standards that are emerging to look at different things. Again, this is a continuous cycle. Nothing is static in this realm. You have bad guys that are, smart and learning quickly how to take advantage of people. I think we talked a little bit about, bribes and digital hostages and reuse of information. My Facebook account has been duplicated, I think, about 4 times so far, and that's going to continue. As long as there are opportunities for this type of interesting crime and whatnot, there are people that are going to take advantage of that. So what do? Well, you have to have a risk-based perspective. And all of the ISO standards now based on what's called Annex SL, I won't get into that, but it's a standardized way of high-level specification for risk and other things. Having a framework so that you can have people that are dedicated, competent, and aligned with the framework, including such things as policies and procedures and the identification of particular controls and the level of assurance or the detailed implementation of the control, then monitoring those controls, having audits, both internal audits and external audits, as with the certification body, and then having management committed and knowledgeable about the organization and the risks associated with it, then you've got a chance. And I think many companies, again, from very small ones who are in a highly competitive environment, especially in the government contract area, to very large ones that have a lion's share of the business in a particular industry or area that are already well aware of it. Again, you don't find many organizations that do a better job than AWS or World Bank, who I worked with for many years, or Sony Pictures, who has to protect motion picture industry content and whatnot, because there's real money involved.
Real risk and liabilities and cost of
Oh yes,
all of the risks that go with those industries that they operate in.
exactly. And it's funny, over the years, again, I've seen a lot of industry standards that were put together. For instance, the gaming industry used to have a standard. They eventually came around to the fact that an existing framework standard, ISO 27001, was probably a good place to start. A lot of best practices, a lot of things that you should do, at least initially. So it's an entry level implementation into that stuff. They now have their own supplement to 27001, and again, if you go to Vegas, MGM, and all the big casinos are certified to that. If you look at Sony used to have their own security standards. They are and have adopted 27001, and they do their own internal self-certification for many of their outlying areas and whatnot. But they have a certification which I've been happy to be involved in for a number of years as well. Theft of a full motion picture is a pretty big thing.
Yeah, like you said, there's real money involved. So if Vegas is involved, we know that it's working for them, right?
Exactly. How do they keep those lights on?
That's right. Well, I think the key point you just mentioned a minute ago was that technology is ever changing with AI, with all the changes in technology, where we're storing our data and how people can access it. How do you protect it? That's always going to evolve. And the good thing about the ISO standards is they evolve with the industry, with the trends. So the risks are modified. The standards are rewritten every 5 years, at least
Yes.
reviewed with a technical committee to say, what do we need to address in today's world, but also maybe projecting further into the future, what could be coming our way. And I know, for
Exactly.
example, in Canada, they're writing standards right now for IA. What's responsible IA management, and so I think the whole technology world, as it evolves, will need these kinds of tools and support systems to evolve with them to help manage that business, that part of their business.
Exactly. And I think that gets down to the one of the basic concepts of this discussion. Why aren't there standards? Well, there are standards. There are many standards.
Right.
And it's very confusing. What has been, until ISO came along, there wasn't a general framework and best practices type of view of this stuff. Again, if you look at CMMC, They have a CMMC accreditation body now. They are planning on doing certification and accreditation audits and whatnot, but they don't have an auditor training course yet. Much of what we have done in the ISO world, has solidified and institutionalized that process. So in my mind, ISO has always been the best way to do it. As you say, it's continually improving. Yep. It focuses on the customer. It focuses on risk. It identifies, reasonable levels of control. And again, in a court of law, intent is everything.
Yeah, it's great due diligence to show that you've implemented the world's class standard for data security management. So that's a nice thing to have on your side as well.
Exactly. Even though ISO, of course, does not claim that these are technical standards, they are not, right? Because that is impossible to do because of the variety of different mechanisms, communication paths, legal regulatory controls, everything else. You can't have a technical standard that covers everything. It just will never happen.
Right.
So that base standard, that criteria for managing the framework, the beginning of a set of controls that are based on best practices and are ever evolving. The newest version of ISO 27001 came out in 2022. That added privacy, for instance, right, which is a really good thing.
Yeah. Yep.
And it added a few other controls, modified some controls, combined some controls to make it, again, more efficient from the standpoint and less confusing from the standpoint of especially small businesses that are looking to implement some kind of control system. Also, if you look back, I was a partner with Ernst & Young for 5.5 years in the New York office in what's called the ISASS group. I've done about 3,000 SAS 70s and SOC 1s and SOC 2s and agreed upon procedures and other things that the Big Four used to do. And they do a lot of good work. However, it's not based on a standard. Right. It's based on a standard for reviewing and for doing audit, but doesn't look at really the risk associated with things. That's up to the organization. And then you get a letter of attest saying, in all material cases, it appears.
Right.
And while that is valuable, and I've seen a lot of good reporting on SOC 2 with testing especially, I think the 27001 process is more efficient, has greater coverage, is better from a risk-based standpoint, and looks at continuous monitoring and improvement.
Well, Bob, it's been great catching up with you. Thank you for sharing all your wisdom and experience. You've been at this for a long time, and this will give people a good flavor of what's going on in the world as far as cybersecurity management and some best practices. And it's just been really valuable in spending this time with you. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Nice to talk to you again. When you get a certain age, you've collected a lot of dirt and detritus on your surface, and if I can remember it, then it works.
Yep, we're all in that boat. So thanks again, Bob. Appreciate it. You're listening to The Review, a podcast by the Performance Review Institute. I'm your host, Randy Daugherty. Thank you for listening. Learn more about The Review at p-r-i.org.